in exchange for Ariel Henry's resignation. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome up the first speaker of the Affirmative team to open their team's case.
Currently, there are gangs all over Haiti who are running ragged, terrorizing every single citizen that they can. We think it's really great when you can get rid of those and keep getting rid of those for a very long time to come. We are the only side that does that. Awesome. What am I going to do in today's speech? Firstly, I'm going to give you like a broad model, what we're going to do. Then I'm going to tell you why it's very likely that Ariel Henry takes the deal that we give him. And then I'm going to discuss why military intervention of this kind is really great for Haiti. Then I'm going to explain what happens and why it's really bad when Ariel Henry stays on. Awesome. What are we going to do? Firstly, we would implement a large-scale comprehensive military support. We would also have an internationally run kind of caretaker government that would try to set up systems, democratic systems, and then put on free and fair elections with oversight from this international group. That means that all the current politicians, i.e. Ariel Henry, can still run if they want to, but because of all of the democratic norms are created at that point. Awesome. We also think that this will mean that they're able to just rebuild the Haiti state better, get better buy-in from civil society, all of the things that democratic norms generally do. We think that's really great. Awesome. Why is it likely that Ariel Henry is likely to take the deal? Firstly, the status quo is really bad for him. There are lots of people who want him dead. Either just people, the gangs who want to overrun the government, or just civilians who aren't big fans of him. There are lots of gangs and warlords all over the country that want to kill him. Secondly, there are very powerful other generals and people in Haiti that want to do a coup on him. We think this is really bad because of all of the bad stuff that is happening in Haiti right now. We think he's a threat to democracy. We think because of that, lots of people just want him dead at that point. We think that it's there's a very high but also very immediate risk of Ariel Henry dying under the status quo. Because of that, he's just far more likely to take a deal that stops that. Also, what we tell you is that the power that he wields is really low. For instance, 60% of Port-au-Prince is overrun by gangs at the moment. If the capital is overrun by gangs, what we tell you is that probably the rest of the country with less infrastructure to block out all of these people is also really run by gangs and probably not good. Because of that, he maybe controls a small part of Port-au-Prince and all the bureaucrats that live there, but he doesn't have any actual real power over the country. Because of that, he probably wants to keep that. Awesome.
Ethan?
Sure.
Haitians have a long history of failed foreign interventions. Why will they accept this UN intervention?
Awesome. Okay, I'll explain that later, but pretty much the broad thrush of it is that anything that is seen to support Ariel Henry is probably bad, so kicking him out and creating that military intervention probably stops it. I'll explain it a little bit later though. Awesome. That means that if he thinks he actually is doing good for the Haitian people, then he can run again, and if he is elected by those people with all the democratic norms that this group provides, then it's fine, because the Haitian people probably like him and he should be democratically, but we tell you that he probably won't because we tell you that they hate him. Also, why do we think this military intervention is great? Context here. There are two broad groups of people that want to oust Ariel Henry. These groups are, number one, the gangs. This is a really important group because this group isn't really driven by ideology. What they are driven by is an opportunistic ability to just garner all of the stuff in the country and then be able to sell it for extortionate prices to the civilians. That means they're not really operating under real ideology of hatred of the American government or hatred of military intervention, stuff like that. What do we think that means? We think that means when tanks roll into Haiti, they go, oh my god, it's going to be really bad, we may as well just cut our losses, take amnesty deals, that sort of thing, because there is no ideological bent behind them. But there's also another group of people. This is the group, this is the large portion of Haitian society that really hates Ariel Henry. What that means is that they have a broad range of wide grievances about him. Either it's normal stuff, like the Haitian government under Ariel Henry really screwed me over for this portion of my life. I was living a pretty well, like, democratic life, then they screwed that over. But also just, like, ideologically, they don't really like corruption, right? And so because of that, they're probably likely to not like him. We think that these people are actually driven by ideology, but the ideology they're driven by is abject hatred of Ariel Henry and his government. Because of that, you need to kick him out in order for those people to be satisfied, in order for those people to be happy. If they see a military intervention prop up, and he is not resigning, then they will see that as just like soft support for Ariel Henry. They'll be really pissed at you, therefore that ideology stands. But also, we think that this military intervention is really great for all of those people that hate him, because these people are like, oh my god, the only way that we can kick Ariel Henry and all of the gangs out is by getting this caretaker government, because the alternative on their side of the house is that gangs run everything. We think that people are actually far more likely to accept democratic norms in their society than the gangs who are actively trying to screw them over. That's a direct response to the POI that was given. Also, what's the impact on this? A military intervention will drive out the gangs because these people have to cut their losses because they cannot beat the US government. But also, we tell you that we get buy-in from large swaths of civil society. What does a civil society look like? It looks like doctors, it looks like lawyers, it looks like academics, the people that are highly educated, probably because of their highly educatedness, don't really like corruption at that sort of level. Because of that, we tell you that these people are far more likely to engage themselves in civil society in a world that is democratic. Because of that, we just get way better state building on our side of the house. What is currently happening is that there are about 10 million people in Haiti, all of which are ruled over in some way by gangs. All of their stuff is stolen by gangs. Like their food, their water, all of their major stuff is stolen by them, because these people, and these people just trying to live regular lives, the gangs take all of their stuff because they're opportunistic on that level, sell it to them for extortionate prices so they can make heaps of money. These people are really, really failing in their lives because of that. You stop the gangs at the point you have military intervention, because they're just way more powerful than those gangs. Also,
Ethan?
No. What happens then when you keep Ariel Henry? We think what happens... Firstly, what we tell you is that life before Ariel Henry was probably not great for Haitian people to begin with. Mostly because even if they were able to create democratic norms in their society, these things like earthquakes happened and screwed the entire country probably out of their control. Then they created all of it. Awesome. So we tell you that there's probably the ability to create democratic norms that have just unfortunately been screwed over by things out of their control. So we tell you that life was probably bad, the government was probably corrupt at a level first. We tell you that when you keep Ariel Henry, all of these people that aren't willing to engage in civil society don't. But what we also tell you is that gangs are far more likely to prop up at that level. The gangs are far likely to drop even with this military intervention. But what we tell you is that Ariel Henry now is seen as the person who drove out all of these gangs because he was the leader. This probably legitimizes his power, and he goes oh, look how awesome I was. I brought in this military intervention that stopped the gangs that were destroying your life. Because of that, we tell you that he's able to just upgrade the military to that level that keeps him in power, because no one can coup him out because he now runs the military. We tell you that he gets gang members in to offer some protection on that level. Now they're under his book, so they're far more likely to do what he wants them to do. We tell you that's really bad, because we tell you that gangs still quasi-run things, but we tell you that it's just entrenches authoritarian norms in Haiti that cannot stand. We stand for democracy. Awesome. Proud to affirm.
Affirmative wants to create elections with no mechanisation of who is likely to win those elections. All they do is put the power of Haiti either in the hands of the US puppet government, which is obviously disliked by the Haitian people, or back in the hands of the gangs and entrenched government control there. What are we going to do in this speech? 3 things. Firstly, set up what do we support. Secondly, on exacerbating violence. And thirdly, why this harms the political situation. Firstly, on setup. What do we support instead? We think that we need legitimate alternative economic opportunities for the people of Haiti. We think that looks like cross-border Dominican Republic support, or building of factories in Haiti. Why is this likely? 2 reasons. Firstly, we still have the same amount of empathy and support that they have from the UN on their side of the house. We're going to tell you that our form of support and our form of aid is far more palatable to the people who contribute to the UN. And that's because development aid, building roads and building economic opportunities for people, is far more popular unpopular in a world where isolationism is increasing. The US refuses to engage in military interventions and have pulled out of Afghanistan recently because their voters don't like the fact that their military is being, is losing lives. That means that they're unlikely to be able to support a big UN force on their side of the house. They only get the ability to say that they support an intervention, not how big that is. But secondly, countries are far more pro-self-sufficiency these days. They no longer want to have to prop up states. They want them to have their own self-sufficient government, and they need them to be able to sort their issues out themselves. They can't go in and run every problem anymore. We think that offering aid to alleviate suffering as well is something we can do quite easily with that UN care, and non-confrontational to help those who are suffering most on the ground. Yes.
Why don't the gangs take all of that aid money and steal it, as they've been doing like for generations and generations?
We think the UN has the same amount of ability on either side of the house to be able to avoid gangs. And that's because simply there are airstrips in Haiti that are controlled by the government as well as airstrips that are controlled by the gang. The UN can land on those airstrips and distribute aid to people in need. They can set up shelters. I think that's simple. Nextly then, on exacerbating violence. The biggest thing we're going to tell you in this point is that gangs control a huge amount of the capital, but specifically one or two large dominant gangs, and they have a lot of support from people on the ground. Note that Haiti is an island nation whose economy is built on sugar plantations that were set up in the 1800s by the US government and US foreign firms that pay those Haitian people incredibly low wages. They despise those jobs, one, because they do not provide enough economic opportunity for them to ever be able to feed their family, for them to ever be able to get out of that poverty trap, because the US exploits them in the way they have exploited other countries in Latin America. That's also secondly unliked from Haiti because they are a nation of people who were exported from Africa to be slaves for the French colonial power, and all the US government does when they create sugar plantations is create another generation of slaves. Next then, they've lost a serious set of economic opportunities due to the earthquake. So, because they hate the US so much, because those economic opportunities don't really provide them any money to be able to feed their family, gangs are the only economic opportunity these people have to be able to gain money, to be able to feed their families, even if it has to be by selling drugs or whatever. Gangs are large pseudo-military groups in Haiti. They're incredibly organized. They control oil rigs. They control airstrips. They control a lot of weapons that are exported to them by Russian dealers, and that means they're able to control a huge amount of Haiti and create economic opportunities for people in selling drugs and exporting them overseas. They're also incredibly powerful because previous governments have emboldened them by ignoring their illegality because of the control they have over people, because that's their only economic opportunity. What do they tell you here about how they're going to be able to shut down incredibly powerful gangs? They tell you that they'll get large-scale international support. Note, there is no mechanisms from Affirmative as to why that is incredibly likely. Why do we think it's unlikely you can get a decisive force? 3 reasons. Firstly, there's a history of failure of UN intervention that has made that unpalatable by countries to send their own forces into that UN intervention force. Look at Mogadishu and Somalia. Secondly, there is way more pressing crises that the UN wants to deal with. It's unlikely they dedicate a lot of those resources and military interventions to Haiti when they're looking at things like helping Ukraine. Thirdly, citizens in these countries are unlikely to support this UN intervention. For example, there's US backlash post-Iraq and seeing what the UN peacekeepers did to citizens of Iraq, but also they fear their own citizens and their own military. UN peacekeepers in Rwanda were shot, for example, and that has created backlash against UN peacekeeping forces. Next, they tell you, oh, but there'll be support for intervention inside of Haiti because people hate Ariel Henry. No mechanization as to why people are likely to hate Ariel Henry. Note that in their best case, I don't think that people support this intervention because, one, they don't punish Ariel Henry. They let him run again. I think I'm saying his name backwards. Secondly, he gets off easy. That is really unpalatable to the Haitian people. Instead, and then they tell you educated people will support it, but that's obviously a small group due to the economic disempowerment of these people. So we tell you that this intervention then looks like, 1, incredibly unpopular by the Haitian people, because 1, that intervention is against gangs, which provide them a huge amount of economic opportunities, but secondly, it reminds them of past trauma. The impacts here are twofold. Firstly, They are angry at the loss of control they continually suffer. They continually have their rights stripped away from them by someone, like a huge overseas power. But secondly, they are uncompliant with this intervention. The gangs are not just happy and willing to step down because it's not an incredibly large force, but even if they are, that's a huge amount of power they would be losing. Instead, they're likely to fight back and make that drag out a really long time. No clear length of time they're willing to stay in Haiti. Are they willing to stay there forever? The next thing to say is they have huge amounts of arms from Russia and the ability to bring support in because they control airstrips, which means this is likely to escalate. Obviously, that harms citizens on the ground who are vulnerable, who are not engaged with gangs, and are now engaged in all-out warfare, guerrilla style, across their streets, like the bombing of oil rigs that they need to survive. Obviously, that's really harmful for the Haitian people. Lastly, on the comparative, in their worst case, the government might, in our worst case, maybe the government tries to fight them a bit, but that's obviously a bit smaller scale. But we think it's far more likely they transition into economic opportunities because it's far more effective and creates alternative for Haitian people that is the most effective way to disempower gangs. Next, on politics. When this person resigns, we think there's two options. Firstly, they install a puppet state. This is going to have a huge amount of backlash due to the context of the first point about why they hate the US and France and all those Western powers. And we think that's incredibly likely because of how bad option 2 is going to be. Which is just that the gangs win the election, right? Like, they give you no reason why that's unlikely. We think that gangs have incredible popular support and they are able to get people along. They're likely to win the election. Firstly, on capacity, two reasons here. One, we already explained to you that they are popular, they have a large loyal gang force, and they're organized. Secondly, there is no credible alternative, and they don't tell you what that's likely to be. Henry is unpopular. The party is tarnished because of Henry's reputation, and the other party hasn't been in power for like 10 years at least. They lack experience. And the gang has an incentive to win this election, because then they would control the country even more than they do. They would be able to ship drugs at an exorbitant rate. They would be able to control all the airstrips, and they can coerce people into vote with the financial control they have over these families. Either of these are awful for the future of Haiti. Escaping the gangs is the only path forward, and all they do is entrench the power of gangs in society and allow those Haitian people never the ability to be able to get out of that economic hole. Either they entrench them in the government, or they trench them by turning away from democracy because of that puppet government is so disliked by them. That means all people do is turn to the gang. Violence it exacerbates across Haiti because there is no other option for them to be able to feed their family.
Kind of bizarre for them to say that it's going to be a really difficult invasion because the US has obvious air supremacy over the gangs in Haiti, and the reason for that is that those gangs obviously don't have a lot of resources. They are dangerous to the unarmed civilians and they are dangerous to each other, but if we just put boots on the ground, it is extremely likely that we are successful, that we are able to kick them out of this debate, out of the streets. What that means is, on the very worst case on our side, maybe it is the case that Henry gets back into power, but he gets back into power in a system where we have kicked the gangs out and created norms of democracy and elections in that state that are way better for the citizens of Haiti. We're happy to support that. Two things in the speech. Firstly, on the comparative between their model and ours and who better helps the people of Haiti, and then secondly, on what happens after our intervention and why it leads to a better government for those people. Firstly, on this, they tell us that they are going to create economic support and development that will be really good for the people of Haiti. Couple of things here. Firstly, we think this this is going to be quite difficult to do when the warlords constantly invade and attack those things, right? And they don't get rid of those gangs. And even to the extent that they do when they say they create all this economic development, it happens over a long-term process, right? So there's a long time that the gangs still exist because things like creating jobs take a while to do. Why is that important? Firstly, because of all the material that Aisha just gave you, because these economic opportunities are directly in competition to them, the gangs have a massive incentive to destroy them at all possible situations. So maybe they don't have the airstrip right now because it's not important to them, but if the airstrip is being used to bring in development opportunities that are directly in competition to them, they focus all of their resources on destroying those things. So they're not actually able to do that. But the reason that that's important in the debate is they say that our problem is that there's no support for a long-scale intervention in their country. But their intervention is also necessarily long-scale, right? So it's not about which side is more able to do that. We think that our intervention is probably even likely to be shorter term because it's boots on the ground that immediately solves things. That's also something that's more palatable and easier to explain to the public than explaining why we're bringing a bunch of money to these people that maybe creates jobs that maybe eventually destroys the gangs. It's way easier to explain to your public, look, there are lots of gangs here, we're just going to destroy them. On the feasibility of destroying those gangs. Firstly, as the material I told you, we think that it is likely that you don't need a really big force, but we also think the UN is likely to be able to provide a really big force. And the reason for that is that obviously there is an incentive for them to do so to the extent that they want to create self-sufficiency in the country, as Aisha says. So it's contingent on us proving that we create self-sufficiency. We probably do, but even if it doesn't, it's more likely to do so than the economic stuff. It's on either side you're going to have this long-term support. Okay, on the gangs themselves then, because the second reason they say it's ineffective is because the people of Haiti really love gangs, and also these gangs are really powerful and control lots of areas. Couple of things. The first thing I wanted to contest is their characterization that there are just two large gangs which really fight each other and are really intense. We think this is really not true, and the situation is that there are a variety of smaller gangs that are vying for power in Haiti. The reason for that is twofold. Firstly, because Haiti is quite ethnically diverse, there are a variety of different backgrounds that exist there, and those gangs tend to coalesce around those ethnic diversities, which means there are lots of different gangs that exist. The second reason is because the situation in Haiti has been extremely dynamic over time. The shifts of power are constantly changing, which creates generation of new systems. Final thing to say here is because there is a constant battle between the government and the gangs, that means it's also likely to generate conflict because things like groups get cut off from each other, which creates new groups springing up. So overall, we say there's lots of different gangs that exist, and you're able to essentially target all of them really easily and quickly with boots on the ground. The final thing to contest here is their argument that people really love gangs because they provide support for their families and they provide an opportunity for money where there is none. The response that we have here is maybe your gang that is in your specific community might be popular with you, but the only way that gang in your specific community gets money is by going out and shooting people in other communities and fighting with gangs there for turf wars. So even if you like your particular gang, which we think you probably don't because you feel exploited by them, because they are likely to seize power from you at all opportunities, because they are opportunistic, because they control over you, even in the instance where you do like your specific gang, you probably broadly hate all of the other gangs in the area that you're in, so you're likely to support an intervention that removes all of the gangs, and you're happy to make that trade-off, particularly when they promise things like prosperity in the future, like having control over your own fate, which is something that the gang in your community removes from you because you only have the capacity to do that. Given that, people of Haiti hate gangs, will be really happy about the intervention, and the intervention will likely be extremely successful, unlike the economic support, which is a losing battle, constantly fighting against those gangs who are trying to stop you from being able to do anything. Okay, on why our intervention is incredibly helpful and good. They tell us that the Haitians actually don't hate their government and they really like it. Obviously, this is untrue, and the reason for that is that it is a corrupt government in the first place, so it is likely that they have done lots of things which disadvantage those people. But the second reason is they are likely to blame that government on the state situation that they are in right now, because Henry has failed them, because he has allowed the gangs to take over, because he is the reason that your brother got shot last week. You blame him for all of those things. So there are lots of Haitians who really hate this particular government, who are likely to be fans of this invasion, and even to the extent that you do like the government a little bit, you are likely to still hate the gangs even more, because Henry has been generating dissentiment about how the gangs are so awful. So if Henry takes the deal, which we say he's incredibly likely to do, what he probably says to you is, this is necessary in order to, we can just get him to say to the public, this is necessary in order to stop the gangs, I will run for re-election in the future and you can vote for me then. So to that extent, we get support from the majority of the population. What does that mean? We tell you, as Ethan says, there is the ability to create democratic norms in this region that's incredibly important. They tell us that the Haitians resist our attempts to create democratic norms because it's really bad for them. Couple of reasons this is unlikely to occur. Firstly, because as I say, they don't like the government very much, so they're likely to support state building. Secondly, for all of the reasons that Ethan gave you that remain unresponded to, which is that the people that you need for state building, people like doctors and lawyers, etc., just hate Henry so much because he has taken away their civil liberties. So it is unlikely that any state building can be successful on their side. They are unlikely to get any kind of support. Yes.
In the last UN intervention, gangs were disempowered and democracy worked for a small period of time, but now gangs have risen again. Why will this time be any different?
Oh, I forgot to say that bit. Thanks. Okay, so what happens is that past interventions have essentially been the UN coming in and reinstating a new dictator, but our system is different because we are going to reinstate elections and create systems of democratic accountability. So what Ethan talked about, things like basically having courts and things like that. Okay, on why Haitians don't resist the invasion. Firstly, because they're likely to support it because of all the state building things that I just talked about. Secondly, because the thing that matters to them right now is their family getting killed, so they probably think about international problems later. Thirdly, because the last intervention was in the 1980s, so they probably don't remember it particularly well, or it can just be framed to them as this one being different, so they're likely to think that. Finally, on the election, they tell us that gang leaders will come in and be elected. Firstly, I tell you it's untrue because of all the material that I just gave you about how the gangs are fractured among communities, and you don't really support any one gang leader. Like, their support amongst their community is maybe be large, but amongst all other communities is really low, so they're unlikely to be able to succeed. We say that what you can additionally do on our side of the house is you can offer gang amnesty to gang members on the street so that they all resign from the gang, but then just arrest the gang leaders if you want to, because presumably they've committed crimes. So we just arrest them and they don't run for election anyway, if that is a necessary case for us to take. Even in the worst case where the gang leaders do become the people who run the country, we tell you that actually that might be a good thing for the country, because when you are in power, when you are in the government, the way that you gain power is by doing things like increasing the quality of life for your citizens, which means the gangs are more likely to do that rather than fight an opportunistic turf wars. The gangs probably step down because they are opportunistic and they don't want to face the might of the UN. We get rid of the gangs, we get rid of Henry, we create a better society for Haitians. Extremely proud to work with them.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the second again to continue the text space.
I'm going to address three things in my speech. Firstly, if this intervention will succeed or prolong the conflict. Secondly, will our economic alternatives work? Thirdly, about democracy. Firstly, is this economic intervention going to succeed? We give you lots of reasons why people in Haiti hate the situation and support the gangs that offer them a viable alternative for making money. I want to respond to what we've heard from the other team. I think there's something implicit in their case, which is that these gangs are terrorizing people. That sort of comes through in Ethan's speech. But this isn't true, right? For two reasons. Firstly, if you look at people who live in states with widespread corruption from everybody around them, they accept that as part of their life. They know, hey, you probably shouldn't cross somebody because they might shoot you or threaten you. You probably just adjust the way you live your life to live by those people's rules. But secondly, these gangs do care about these communities because they come from these communities, right? They use that money to build roads. Yes, the gang leaders do have a significant amount of money, and yes, that a lot of that money goes through to buying weapons and to buying more drugs, but they do also give back because that is where they live and that is what they care about. Note that we hear no response to the mechanisms we give you about the history, about why people are really opposed to the West and view the gangs as, you know, their community acting on their behalf. But secondly, we hear no response to the fact that these gangs are armed to the teeth because they are drug gangs that get arms from Russian arms dealers. What do we hear instead? Lucy comes and spins some crazy story about how these gangs are small because of ethnic diversity and geographic distance. But these are just straight up lies, right? Haiti is half of an island. There is no room to have gangs running entirely different operations because you would know where somebody's airstrip is, right? It's very hard to actually maintain yourself in like a gang conflict for a long time, given it's such a tiny space. But secondly, Haiti isn't ethnically diverse, right? They have a very common history as a population, which is that a huge amount of them are descended from people who were shipped over as slaves to uphold France's colonial regime in those islands, right? So I think it's not true they're ethnically diverse. They probably have a common history, and there's not a significant amount of gangs. What we think actually is that a natural monopoly is likely to form, and that means that these gangs do have a lot of support. The next thing that we talk about, though, is that any intervention is likely to be incredibly weak. And we give you 4 mechanisms for that, right? We talk about a history of failed intervention. We talk about how people are critical of their own government's motivations now, how people are scared for their citizens. Look at the atrocities that were enacted upon UN peacekeepers in Rwanda, but also because countries that have other priorities, right? There is so much financial insecurity. We're looking at Russia potentially invading Eastern Europe, right? Like, obviously other countries in the West are more concerned about themselves. What do we hear instead? No direct response, just some other like faffy stuff about how, oh, the West have air supremacy, we're gonna put feet on the ground. The problem is, this has not ever worked before for the fact that they lack actual strategy, right? Look at what happened in Somalia. Yes, they had supreme forces, but they failed because they didn't adequately plan and just use brute violence, and that was obviously not effective. But second thing I want to add here is, even if it's about absolute supplies, I think the armies in Western nations are currently having significant recruitment issues, right? It is very difficult for them to find people, given trauma from the wars enacted in the early 2000s, right? So these are not people that have military to spare, especially given the conflict in Ukraine. But finally, the idea that gangs lack resources is ridiculous. These gangs run a significant and strong drug trade. What does that require? It requires planes, it requires a lot of young men, and it requires fuck tons of arms. That means they're obviously going to be very strong. It's very hard to win this battle. Why does this point matter? Firstly, the other team is entering a conflict and they're going to escalate it. That is absolutely terrible. On our side, by Af's characterization, maybe, Henry might lose, maybe he might get cooed, maybe something else will happen that's just not going to have that huge amount of unnecessary suffering exacerbated by the West that doesn't know when to quit. But secondly, this is going to cause intense trauma for the people who live there. Because note the fact we're talking about a country that has experienced interventions from the West before that have absolutely devastated them. What does that trauma look like? It looks like long-term generational harms. People resist aid from the West because they don't trust them. It ruins the relationships between family members because older generations are so shell-shocked they cannot connect with their children. But also, it sets the groundwork for more violent, ruthless anti-West leaders to come in the future and exploit that population and enact populist policies that actually harm those people. This point alone should win us the debate, regardless of whether or not you get some mild democratic benefits. Yes.
Given that you guys also require some level of intervention, don't you just have all of those harms too?
No, because we're not fighting anybody. We're just providing economic alternatives, right? Let's talk about those economic alternatives. The main response we hear from the affirmative team is that gangs are obviously going to be incredibly opposed to you doing this. Firstly, I don't think it's necessarily true. These are not directly confrontational with the gangs like military violence is, and these gangs are probably concerned with protecting their supplies and making sure, they're managing to get arms from other places, right? I think it looks really unpopular given they come from these communities and are significantly involved with these communities to be seen as actively harming citizens as opposed to where they have legitimate reason to oppose the government who aren't good, right? But secondly, it's just untrue that they have absolute geographic control. The way that Haiti works right now is currently, yes, the gangs do control significant portions of airfields, but you still have the ability of the government to control some, to distribute that. We think that those economic opportunities are likely to be good. This means that in the long term, young and vulnerable men and women aren't going to have to join gangs. You will slowly disempower those gangs and give people a feasible alternative. We think that's far better, even if it's less likely than, a perfect solution. Finally, though, I want to talk about democracy. The first claim we make is that gangs are going to win the election. This is what Lucy focuses on. What she says is, firstly, she says, oh no, everyone hates gangs. I think I've already shown my gangs are quite integral to the community and they're incredibly powerful organised entities, so that's not going to happen. But secondly, she says that, oh, we'll just get Henry to say it's really necessary to defeat the gangs. That's so bizarre because by their characterization, nobody likes Henry, right? Why would his word have any credibility? I also just think a leader that would be leaving their country has very little credibility anyways. Their tail is between their legs. Why would people view them as somebody who actually is doing this for a reason as opposed to cowering and running from threats of assassination? But the next thing she says is that they're just going to arrest the gang leaders so they can't run or offer them amnesty. You can't just say you're going to do that. We talked to you about why these gangs have immense social, popular, and violent, like physical control in Haiti. It's very unlikely you can just arrest them all and prevent anybody from doing that.
Last chance.
No, I already took one. But secondly, they tell you they're going to install a puppet government. And they say, no, you know, this is going to be different. We're going to have an election. The info slide literally describes how last time we were in Haiti, we installed a democratic leader of our own choosing. Why would we possibly do anything different? I think this is incredibly likely if the West is scared that a gang leader is going to be elected. They likely are very scared of that because of what's happened in other countries. That means they're more likely to push for a certain candidate and you undermine democracy. But I don't even think democracy matters. It's not the most important thing. Firstly, note Haiti has incredibly weak political structures, so you're still likely to have lots of corruption even if you have a true democratic figurehead. But secondly, democracy affects the daily lives of people very, very little. They talk about how highly educated people care about democracy. How many highly educated people are there after decades of structural oppression from the West, right? Obviously, the vast majority of Haitians live on very tiny wages or subsistence farming, and for them, why would you care about voting, exercising your right to vote once every 3 or 4 years, as opposed to having access to better economic opportunities, having medicine, having the opportunity to buy healthy drinking water? Obviously, this doesn't matter to real Haitians. Proud to negate.
Like, thanks to for this speech, and we'll use the speech to close off the substantive
We've heard that Haiti is so small it would be impossible to have more than 2 gangs. And then we have heard that the combined military forces of the UN would not be able to take it because it is such a vast and untakeable challenge. We think that they are right, it is very small, which means it's very easy. But also, it's not true at all that being a small place means you can only have 2 gangs. Because, for instance, big cities like New York and LA, which have a small area but a lot of people, just like Haiti, have lots and lots of gangs that fight each other from different immigrant backgrounds over turf wars. What am I going to do in my speech? Firstly, I'm going to ask, do we love gangs? No. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what that military conflict looks like and compare and contrast it to their economic development model. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the long-term future of Haiti. So firstly then, do we love gangs? It was explicit from first that the gangs are called gangs because they terrorize people, that's how they make their money, etc. The two responses, the two responses we hear to this are, firstly, people in Haiti kind of have a social contract with the gangs where they are willing to accept a certain amount of corruption and stuff in return for protection. The first line response to this is, if that is true, we think they will also have a social contract where they are willing to accept a military intervention by the West if it provides them with stability and security, which it is explicitly promising. But second, even if you have that contract with your local gang, which wasn't really responded to, other than the assertion there are just two, that all of the other gangs then, in order to provide for their own people, need to go and harass your community, so you probably hate the gang system on the whole. No, even if there are only two gangs, that means there is at least one large, well-armed group with a direct incentive to go and kill you and take your stuff. So that's a worse place to live in than if we have one invading force that gets rid of all of them. Okay. But also, we tell you that if it was true that the gangs were just benevolent to their communities, where would they be getting all of this money from? But also, finally, what we tell you is, maybe at the management level, the gangs generally care about their communities, but in order to function as a gang that has turf wars and spats and shit, you have to recruit nutjob 18-year-olds off the street and give them guns and an AK-47, and they probably just do a bunch of random shit like shooting people on the street randomly, and you have to support them as a gang leader because they're your foot soldiers. So generally, even with kind of good intentions at the top level, gangs have a really traumatic impact on local communities. Okay, so we don't love gangs. And the people of Haiti, importantly, don't either, and we probably like to see them go. What does that... Sure.
If these gangs are so busy fighting each other, where are they going to find the time and resources to fight our economic development opportunities?
Because basically you institute your UN intervention as a new competing gang, right? Because you're now setting up protection rackets over your specific economic opportunities, and unless you're protecting them really well, then they'll just go and try and steal the free money that you're pumping into their country. So you need a pretty strong, hefty military weight to go and protect that. Okay. Finally then, just the ethnic diversity point, right? They're like, oh no, Haitians have a common background as slaves. But the European slave trade took people from all over the world and put them in one place. So that's a mechanism for our side for why it's likely that there is lots of diversity within Haiti. Okay, so that's why we tell you there are a lot of gangs, but even if there aren't a lot of gangs, there are more than one gang, which means there is conflict, there is death. It's not a system people want. That means that we think there's probably either positive reception to our invasion, or at least people are willing to give it a shot because the status quo is very bad for them. What does that mean about the military conflict? We told you that gangs aren't driven by ideology, they're driven by opportunism, so if it's obvious that they'll lose, they'll back down. Note that that means when countries are making this risk calculus about should I go in, they probably can assess this relatively quickly, so they know if they just put up enough tanks to scare away the gangs, there's very low risk of casualties. But secondly, we hear, oh no, the gangs are really well resourced, so they'll be able to fight back against conventional militaries. Maybe gangs have all the resources they want, but what gangs want to do right now is fight other gangs and shoot people on the street. That means they have handguns and things that you can use to shoot people on the street. There's no need for them to have things like anti-tank weaponry because there are no tanks in Haiti for them to fight. So the first thing you do is you establish instant air supremacy because you're literally next door to the US. That means they can't import any new weapons, and then you just put one tank and they have no anti-tank weaponry, so they're instantly fucked. But more importantly than that, they told us people join gangs for economic opportunity. So if you just offer them $100 US if they give up their gun and go home, they probably will, because they're not loyal to any ideology. They'll take whatever works for them. So we tell you that all of the foot soldiers step down, and you probably have this over very, very quickly, because the gangs just fold both at the ground level, and the people at the top are like, shit, we can't win this, let's get out and cut our losses. But even if there is some pushback from the gangs, we tell you that the status quo is a bunch of gangs fighting and shooting each other. So our worst case scenario is a military and the gangs fighting and shooting each other. There's objectively not more bloodshed, right? There's just lots of fighting and shooting. So we tell you that all of that stuff about trauma to Haitians isn't true. Because every day in Haiti is traumatic right now. We don't make it worse. But what we'll tell you is, after the short burst, in the worst case where there is a war, after that, For the first time in like 10 years, there is not anarchy, there is not constant bloodshed, and that brings me in to why, for the long-term future of Haiti, we're really important. But before I do that, I just want to talk through the economic development thing. They've told us that gangs aren't going to take away these economic developments. One, because they're busy fighting each other, but like, if you can get lots of free money by raiding an oil rig or like crates of supplies that are being shipped in, obviously you'll do that to get more money to be able to overpower the other gangs. But secondly, they tell us no, gang members care about their local communities. Firstly, then they'll just steal from other local communities' economic development stuff, right? Secondly, they told us that people are used to gangs racketeering off them and stuff, and that's part of the social contract, so it's probably they would just do that to their own community. But third, if it's true that they are able to get rid of gangs by making everyone leave the gangs and go to these economic opportunities, the gangs will obviously see that as an existential threat and try and counter it. If their model works, gangs must have an incentive to try and stop it. Now let's talk about the long-term future. The first thing I want to say is a lot of their material is like, oh, you might set up some stability now, but in 5 or 10 years' time it might collapse because it did before. Firstly, last time there was an earthquake. You can't control for that. Like, we hope there won't be an earthquake. But secondly, even if there will be an earthquake, we would rather that the West spends a bit of arms money and the Haitians get to live in stability and security for 5 years, and then it goes back to the status quo, because you can't be worse than the status quo, because at least we get them 5 or 10 years of not dying in the streets, of not having medicine locked to them, of not being able to heat their homes, right? But also, like, a lot of their responses here are basically, Haitians have like an ingrained like hatred and mistrust of the West. Firstly, we tell you that a lot of the stuff they talk about, like slavery, like the 1980s invasions, most Haitians weren't alive when that happened, so it's much less relevant to them than if a gang member killed your friend a month ago. The ongoing stuff happening right now is always front and center of their mind, so if you can alleviate the immediate suffering and put the power into their hands, that's important. We don't have to get a perfectly democratic state, we just make the status quo a bit better. Millions of people are now in stability instead of dying in turf wars, and we're happy if that's what we get.
Peter's characterization of these gangs being weak might work in debate land, but it doesn't actually reflect what's actually happening in Haiti right now. Why are these Haiti gangs so powerful, so rich, and have the support of the people? One, they have so much money because they push drugs through the country into the US. That means that's where they get all their money from, to buy arms from that guy that just got prisoner swapped. They literally do have like all of their gang members armed to the teeth. They have enough to fight back against the US if the US is going to, like, you know, they needed to prove that the US was even going to be a part of this intervention. But secondly, they don't just have money, they have organization. They have so much of an organization that they literally control ports in the country. They are able to be a legitimate oppositional force to the government. What does that prove? It proves that the characterization that they rely on for this intervention to be swift and easy doesn't make sense, because you are going to get a strong oppositional force, and that's just the gangs themselves, right? They then also needed to engage with the fact that the public actually support them because they're so rich. They provide a legitimate alternative economically, because instead of slaving away on a plantation like your ancestors did, which is fucking depressing in the first place, to make like less than $1 a day, now you can work for the gang and make an actual living to actually feed your family. That means that these gangs are not only very powerful, but they actually do have public support. They needed to do a lot more work there. 3 things in the speech, Lynn. Firstly, why this military intervention doesn't work now that I've clarified the context of this debate. Secondly, why this government will never be accepted by Haitians. And then finally, why our economic alternative is still the most legitimate form to fix Haiti. Let's look at military intervention then. But note that the nature of the military
their military intervention was very, very vague, Ethan, and basically just asserted and then developed down the line. So I think you ought to punish them for that, because they needed to strongly prove it from the start of the debate why this military intervention worked, especially after Aisha gave a very, very clear conception of why they have so much control in Haiti. Firstly, she told you that the international community is busy. They have Ukraine to worry about. They have growing concern from their public about sending troops, especially considering even previous peacekeeping missions saw French soldiers literally shot in the head in Rwanda when they were trying to prevent genocide. So this means that the West isn't going to, be able to send their best or send huge amounts of arms or huge amounts of army personnel into the country. What does that mean? It means you're likely to get another Mogadishu. You're likely to get another unsuccessful invasion, because you do have a very, very organized opposition to try and defeat. They needed to actually mechanize why the international community was going to be willing to send so much money and so much troops into this country, given that that was the context of this debate. But secondly, like I already told you, right, these gangs are armed to the teeth in an incredibly organized way. So even if there are fraction gangs, like they're still going to be fighting, right? They're still going to be fighting back against whoever comes into the country, and the public is always going to choose the gangs who feed them, whose brother is obligated to fight for them. They're always going to pick that side rather than the UN, because the UN has such a negative reputation amongst the citizens, because the UN literally just hasn't done anything for them other than literally reinforce the oppression that they experienced when they were former slaves. What did they say? They just asserted that people hate gangs, but note that Lucy, that characterization was contingent on there being multiple gangs within this country. Why aren't there multiple gangs? One, this is half of an island. You can't hide airstrips from each other when you're occupying the same land. Grace gave that analysis, but then they said, oh, it forms around ethnicities and different fracturing groups within the island. That's not true. That's also an insertion, because we told you, the fact is that all of these people are descended from ex-slaves, so maybe they might have different ethnicities, like Peter tried to assert, but they don't know that ancestry because they are all ex-slaves. That's literally the depressing thing, is that they had that stolen from them, and that is why they're especially angry and why they're all united in forming these singular forms of gangs. Why do people not hate gangs, even now that I've proven that there are maybe one or two, if you're being really charitable to them? Firstly, they have that economic incentive that I already explained to you. And this is very visceral for the people, right? Because these gangs build roads to ship drugs around the country. That is actually showing some kind of functional governance that the Haitian people have not seen from their own government, which shows that they are going to support them, because even if they might be violent sometimes, they have some kind of benefit out of it. But secondly, like Grace told you, they're not unpredictably violent, and they're only violent in a way that people can understand, right? There's their own kind of law and logic within the system. So that means that people are happy to live within the system, because it's not just willy-nilly violence. They needed to actually explain why that would happen, because this isn't where people buy and sell drugs. This is just a moving hub. So there is no incentive for the gangs to attack their own people. They want them all as part of their own gang and to support the operations there. But thirdly, even if you don't buy any of those mechanisms, your family is in the gang, your brother is in the gang, your son is in the gang, because that was what they got tempted into it because of the money opportunities. So you're likely to support the gangs because you don't want your brother to die, you don't want your son to die in this inevitable conflict where they will always be, the ones marched to death against the US or whatever. Lucy then tried to say that, the US is obviously stronger, so this will be a really quick and easy intervention. Punish them. Where's the mechanization? Absolutely unacceptable to explain that this will just happen, especially after Aisha gave you examples where the exact opposite happened, where they went in, balls high, I'm so good, I have a great military, and then got absolutely fucking smacked by, these gang groups, which are, this situation is very analogous to Somalia, because that was also, an organized gang situation that wasn't the government. But firstly, told you that they're armed. I told you that the public supports these gangs. Let's weigh this point then. So I've just proved to you overall that because the public supports the gang, because they cannot, like, they needed a really organized military situation to actually be successful in that military organization, that means that the best case for them is, even if you don't believe any of my material about why the gangs won't be defeated, if the gangs do go, they still needed to prove their next point, which is why the government that takes their place is organized and is able to continue to build the roads that the gangs currently do. Because they aren't likely to do that, right? There are going to be lives lost. There are going to be thousands of bodies littering the streets, even if they get this successful military organization. But I told you the most likely scenario is that the gangs don't get defeated, which means that you have to buy our material and we win the debate there. Let's look at why they don't support the government. I already told you like what the context of Haitians are, but Peter then just tried to like make up some more mechanisms about how like the people, the collapse in 2017 was because of the earthquake. Peter, it was in 2007. That means 10 years later, after the earthquake, the government collapsed again and the UN intervened. That means that this is, that wasn't that long ago. People will remember that. People still firstly hate democracy. Secondly, they still hate the West. And thirdly, they still support the gangs, which means that they had a higher burden than they set for themselves to prove why people will actually support this incoming government or this government will be effective. Because people aren't going to like the elections. The elections aren't going to work because, like Aisha told you, that even if the elections do work, they'll probably just elect it again because that's like the incumbent power. People know those faces. People like agree with those faces because they do a lot. Overall, because our economic development material still stands, we need to siphon people off the one mouth, the one hand that feeds them, give them an alternative, link them up with the stable Dominican Republic that's next door, and allow them to stop the control of gangs without this violence that they definitely cause.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the neutral pod.
Cool, is everyone ready? I'm going to do two things in this reply. Firstly, engage on political change, and secondly, engage on increasing violence. Firstly, on political change. I'm dealing with this first because in order to win this debate, Affirmative has to prove political change because it's their only path to being able to improve Haiti in the long run. They give you no mechanisms why it's likely that they will set up a democratic election and why that democratic election will be worthwhile. The only mechanism we get to that is at Lucy, to flip our mechanism about self-sufficiency, like how the West wants self-sufficiency, to say, see, they want democratic governments. A puppet state, which the West is likely to implement because of how bad the gang alternative is also a way to be self-sufficient, as we tell you at Grace, to no response. Because that allows the West to say they're running their own country, we just have, someone who will back us up and we, know that they will be good for us. I think that's better. They'd rather that they run their own country in a way that's a puppet state rather than turning to the gangs. And they never engage with how bad that puppet state is. We tell you that due to rising anti-West sentiment, that's due to the fact that they've been literally oppressed for generations, these people hate the puppet state. They turn against democracy. They don't engage with those political systems. They head back into the gangs and entrench that gang power, because why would they engage with a system that continues to oppress them, that continues to colonize them, that continues to deny them economic opportunities and pay them $1 at the sugar plantation? That is something that Haitians would never stand for. They're unlikely to support that puppet government. That means even in their best case, that when they're able to install a government of political change, they never get any sort of long-term change on democracy and the country just falls back into gang violent hands, but those gangs are now more empowered. Peter's the first person to respond to this push on why they hate the West, but he responds to the version that comes out in my speech, not the nuanced version that comes out in Grace's speech, to say that that generational divide means that anti-West hatred is passed on from slavery, is passed on from all those interventions, not just whether they lived at the time. Note here, they have no long-term path to being able to keep that democracy thriving, so at their best they can only get a short-term benefit. No response to the material at Grace about why Haiti continues to backslide over and over time, because Grace here shows a long-term alternative about populism rising and further anti-West settlement that will just impoverish Haiti, about continuing corruption as those as those institutions continue to fall, no response, that's really damning for them because that's a terrible long-term alternative for Haiti. Even if they prove this though and you're like, yay, democracy is great. No engagement with Grace's weighing about why democracy is less important than the situation on the ground. They cannot win on this material. They cannot win the debate. Next then, on violence. I want to note here that they never want to engage with their worst case, they only push their best case. I think if you believe their worst case is likely, then again we're able to win the debate. Because we tell you there isn't likely to be a UN force, and we give you a bunch of incentives at my speech and build out more incentives at Grace about why citizens in countries are unlikely to want this, about why the UN has other priorities, about the fear of UN intervention because of the shooting of peacekeepers. The only response we get to this is like, no, you'll see how bad Haiti is because the gangs are running it. But it's unclear why citizens care about gangs and why they'll send their own forces to Haiti to be able to deal with it. They stopped caring about the Taliban, which is way more important than Haiti. They need to directly impact those citizens to ever get citizen support. And we tell you at my speech, Haiti is never on the radar of anyone in the West. They send very small forces. And those small forces aren't enough to deal with the gangs. Peter's main push is to say that gangs are weak. Firstly, obviously we tell you they're clearly running competent engagement, but secondly, that is marginal compared to limited Western support. We give you the will at my speech, the knowledge at Grace's speech to say they don't have the will and they don't have the knowledge to run effective interventions. Those gangs won't step down. They will run circles around the West with the support they have from Russian airstrips, the support they have from the people on the ground, but if they don't, they will continue to fight until their dying breath. Because they fucking hate the West and there's never any engagement on that. They will not just let the West come in and take their country from them again. They will stand up, even if that means that millions of Haitians die. You cannot let them do that to an island country that does not deserve to be fucked over any longer.
Pretty large burden push from Aisha to say that we have to prove that Haiti in the long term will become a successful state. We think we are able to prove that because the people who don't like Henry are likely to be beneficial in building that state. But even if we don't, we think we provide a better system for the people of Haiti because we're better able to get rid of the gangs. And they don't give a long-term plan of what this economic development actually looks like. The gangs always remain on their side. We give people a life without gangs. We are better for them, even if it is a system with gangs and with people in power. It's not a system of anarchy that is better for people. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, on the characterization of gangs, then a comparison of intervention versus the economic development material, and finally on the long-term future. Firstly, on the characterization of gangs, I think what they tell you essentially, the first thing to say here is that even to the extent that they rely on an incentive that gangs have to not attack people, that means they are not violent, we give you lots of reasons why they structurally have to. Things like the fact that they need to commit violence on their own people to get the money in the first place, and secondly, that they structurally require things like lots of angry young men who go out and commit crime, basically commit crimes against civilians anyway. So it's extremely likely that the gangs are violent and oppress the people within those communities and outside of their communities. But even in a world in which people like the gangs because they give them economic opportunism, we think that means they will move based on what gives them a better deal, and that's going to come into play with our intervention material. But they tell us that people will trade off security and ideology, which we think means that if the Western system is able to provide them with that security, they are likely to make that trade-off. So especially given the fact that, as Peter tells you, there is a divide there is a generational divide, which means that people don't remember the West as so terribly as they did before. On intervention versus economic success. First thing they tell you, the characterization that they give you is that these gangs are large, powerful groups with Russian weapons shipping drugs into the West. Then they tell you that the West has no incentive to stop these gangs. Obviously that is not true, as we've told you down the line. They have a massive incentive due to their own material about how they want to promote self-sufficiency and democracy in these countries. They are likely to want to do that. Then they tell us that because these gangs are large, powerful groups, we're unlikely to be able to stop them. The problem is they don't engage with 2 of the unique nuances which make these gangs really easy to fight. First, are driven by opportunism, and they don't engage with that incentive ever when they just talk about how these gangs are good. So they treat it like an assured thing that the gangs are definitely going to respond and try to fight back. We think they probably won't in the majority of cases. And the important thing here is it doesn't have to be that the West will definitely succeed. Even if there is just a really high chance that the West succeeds, we still win on our side. And the reason for that is firstly that due to their own characterization, the people in these gangs are only in it for the economic benefit to themselves. So if we're just able to give them some money, they're likely to go away, they're likely to not fight in the war for very long. But secondly, because those leaders are self-interested, they are likely to fold particularly easily. They are risk averse in that sense because they want to protect themselves. Okay, the second piece of nuance they don't engage with is they say that they have lots of weapons. We tell you they don't have the type of weapons that are necessary because we can just come in with air supremacy and stop them being able to get Russian anti-tank weapons in the first place. So they don't engage with that. That means that it's really easy, not that many resources are needed. The second thing I want to say here and moving on to the economic material, the thing that's important about this is that it takes a really long time because the gangs continue to fight, but they also don't provide a long-term pathway to independence because when the gangs are there, it means that you have to continually support all of this development because the gangs, as Peter said, have an incentive to try and stop that development as much as possible. Why is that important? It means that in order to protect them, you require a lot of money and a lot of men on the ground to protect those systems, which means that all of their incentives about the West apply on both sides anyway. But what I told you that they never engage with is that it's less palatable to citizens to support long-term economic development as opposed to just having boots on the ground, because that's the kind of thing that's easy to understand by the West. So we get more support for our system. Finally, on the long-term future, I mainly addressed this in my introduction. We don't need this to win. Life under gangs is so awful. Just getting rid of them is everything, because especially because the economic alternative takes a really long time. Now these people have a justice system. They have the ability to build things. That's really good for them. We get rid of the gangs.